Howdy, this is your host today, Jim Mars, here on Dreamland, and today we're going to be talking with Dr. Nick Begich, probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about the HAARP array in Alaska, of which we've heard so much, and about its uses for weather control and maybe even more sinisterly, mind control. Nick, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Can you briefly, I know it could probably stretch on, but briefly give us a little bit of your background, your education, and what qualifies you to know so much about electromagnetic energy and its uses?
Well, this particular area we've followed for the last 15 years. I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines with an interest in electrophysiology, the effects of electromagnetic fields on the human body. My other background is political. I come from a highly political family here in Alaska. In fact, my brother Mark is running for the U.S. Senate this year. My dad was in the United States Congress, was in the state Senate for a number of years. I've been active in the Alaska Federation of Teachers, the Anchorage Council of Education, twice being elected president of both organizations, and I've written 5 books in 7 languages, primarily on technology and science. I also serve as the executive director of the Lay Institute on Technologies, which is a Texas-based nonprofit organized around educating the public on the effects of technologies.
Right. And isn't it true that your dad was lost on the same plane flight as Senator Hale Boggs?
Right. It was Congressman Boggs was the majority leader in the U.S. House at the time. This is back in the early 1970s, just before the Watergate hearings. The plane disappeared, was never recovered, no wreckage found, nothing all these years.
Right. And just as a side note there, Representative Boggs from Louisiana was one of the first of the Warren Commission members to publicly question their findings about a lone assassin.
Right, that's correct. In fact, he had strong feelings about that, as well as strong feelings about the FBI in terms of what they were doing at the time. They were responsible for tapping congressional phone lines, for intercepting mail, a lot of things that he found objectionable. He really disliked J. Edgar Hoover, who by that time was gone, but primarily because he was essentially blackmailing the Congress. The FBI was essentially a rogue institution, and again, just before Watergate, where a lot of things changed at the federal level by virtue of the fact that people lost confidence.
Right, starting with Nixon, and then particularly through the Reagan years, and now we see the culmination of this today. And but that may be a whole different discussion.
Well, it is related, Jim, because, back in those days, that was when the church committee hearings began shortly thereafter,
right.
A lot of investigation into abuses of government, which, of course, Richard Nixon was famous for. And we're kind of going through that again. The privacy issues are back on the plate. People are concerned. I mean, the issue we're talking about today, mind control, the ultimate issue of personal privacy all these years later, but on the backdrop of very, very new technology.
Exactly, and that leads me to my first question, which I can't wait to hear your response, is that on the Internet now there is a lot of chatter going on about the possibility that the recent devastating earthquake in China may have been actually man-made, may have been generated, and some people are even pointing the finger at the HAARP array. With your background on HAARP, number one, is it possible to use that technology to generate earthquakes? Number two, do you feel like that this recent earthquake may indeed be a result of that technology?
Well, it certainly could be used in that way. We talked about it in our very first book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, years ago. And there's also a more recent quote dealing with electromagnetic waves affecting these things. And this is from Secretary of Defense William Cohen, and we quoted it in Earth Rising, the Revolution, and it says, others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves, unquote. Now, that was back in April of 1997 when Secretary William Cohen was Secretary of Defense, and he made that comment. Now, with HAARP, you can actually manipulate gravity waves. And as a consequence, there's a lot of concern that this could be used for exactly that, for geophysical manipulation. And HAARP has the ability of being the signal being manipulated in such ways as to couple with these natural systems of the Earth affecting things like climate, things like earthquakes, based on the research we've done, and hundreds and hundreds of footnoted sources, as well as discussions with the inventor, Dr. Bernard Eastland, right up until his death in December of last year. We had an open dialogue with Dr. Eastland regarding these kinds of effects.
Well, you know, it actually even goes back to Lyndon Johnson, who once talked about the control of weather and using it as a weapon. In fact, Nick, I recall in the 70s, as a reporter for the Metropolitan newspaper, I wrote a big research article about weather war.
Right.
This is something they've been working on for decades, right?
Right. In fact, Johnson was involved in, that early work when they were doing cloud seeding in Vietnam and, that kind of thing. But when you look at what's happened and even what was happening then, there's some great work. J.F. Gordon MacDonald from UCLA, he was a geophysicist. He was also a science advisor to Johnson, and he talked about this in a book called Unless Peace Comes. He wrote a chapter called How to Wreck Your Environment, which was exactly about this, geophysical manipulation, earthquake generation, tidal waves, volcanic eruptions, and so on. And it was not too many years later, in fact, about a decade later, in 1977, that the United States signed off on an international treaty where we agreed not to use geophysical manipulation as a weapon of war. And that included, all of those things that J.F. Gordon MacDonald and that Johnson was, in fact, talking about.
Right. And I correct myself. Actually, I finally found this quote. It comes from Lyndon Johnson, who was speaking to the Senate Democratic Caucus on January the 7th, 1958. And he stated, "Control of space means control of the world. From space, the masters of infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides, raise the level of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream, and to change the climate to frigid." Whoa.
Doesn't that sound familiar?
Yeah, it's amazing. So this is not just sheer science fiction. This is things they've been working on for a long time.
Absolutely, and this is kind of like the ultimate war from a military perspective. I mean, consider if you could isolate a country so they couldn't grow food for a couple of decades.
Well,
kind of like North Korea.
What if they're able to create a tornado and it destroys your house? Insurance adjusters who say, well, it was an act of God.
Right. And this is part of it in all of the discussions on weather warfare, and we quote dozens and dozens of military journals and articles in our work. And what you see consistently in this is it's the ultimate covert war. I mean, you've got plausible deniability because, only God manipulates the weather.
Right.
And yet, here we have technological applications that Secretary of Defense was even warning that terrorist states possess this science. In other words, it's not that sophisticated, believe me, if you can do it in some closet in the middle of the mountains in Pakistan. Right. And that's the kind of thing that they were talking about here was it's not so sophisticated, it's just the ability to understand and utilize that science.
Well, but also doesn't it require massive amounts of energy?
Well, yes and no. There's something to be said for the effects of resonance and the triggering effects. Yes, HAARP is a huge system. It produces tremendous energy, but there's a lot to be said for small amounts of energy delivered in just the right way, where you get a resonance effect, an increased a kind of a nonlinear effect. With HAARP, for instance, when you use it in certain applications in the ionosphere, a layer that begins about 30 miles above the Earth's surface, you can actually trigger an event that sort of grabs energy that's already there and amplifies the signal that you send up, which is already huge, but amplifies it by up to 1,000 times. So that's it's kind of a nonlinear effect. The energy is already in the ionosphere, but the instrument on the ground acts as a trigger. The same could be said for like triggering earthquakes, where there's pent-up energy where you're just sending in just enough in the right way to cause that energy to release. So you're using both the system itself, but then natural energy that is tremendous. I mean, in terms of size, way more energy available in these natural systems than what man's producing. But man is sort of the primer on the bullet, if you will.
Kind of like acupuncture for the Earth.
Right. It's the same kind of idea. You're zeroing in on energy transfers and taking advantage of the way in which energy is handled by the Earth, and then manipulating that, whether it's the magnetic field lines that surround the planet, or whether it's these energized layers that you're capitalizing on by understanding enough about their physics to then apply instruments on the ground to literally plug right into the planet and cause it to change its character so that then it can affect physical systems or biological systems like you and I.
Amazing. Well, we need to take a break about right now, so let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to ask you if you think that the recent earthquake in China may have been the result of this technology. This is Jim Mars. This is Dreamland. We're talking to Dr. Nick Begich, and we'll be back right after this. Howdy. This is Jim Mars. We're back here on Dreamland. Today we're talking to Dr. Nick Begich, and we've been talking about weather modification, Earth changes being created by electromagnetic energy, and specifically the HAARP array. That's the High Altitude Auroral Research Project in Alaska, Nick's home state. And we're talking about the recent catastrophic earthquake in China, which we're still hearing about because of these lakes that were created, and some of them are beginning to give way, and there's thousands of people that are still in danger from these quakes. Nick, on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say the odds are that this was a man-made cataclysm?
Boy, I couldn't really rank it that way, but it's certainly possible, and that's the big deal here. Is there's lately, because of a lot of the work that's been done, people kind of look at these situations and start asking the question, was it natural, or did we do it? And in almost every instance, whether it's Hurricane Katrina, this latest earthquake, the tidal wave, that happened a couple years back.
Yeah.
And all these things are possible, and that's why we keep hearing this every time we have an event. And the other thing that's important is these rumors start somewhere, and maybe there's something to them, but without the independent monitoring, because here's what's really important, is these signals that man creates are called coherent signals. They have a rhythm to them. They have something that is clearly distinguishable from sort of the natural background noise, if you will. And so monitoring this could be done on a broad scale. In other words, we could know absolutely if there was open monitoring of this, multinational monitoring of this type of activity, because it should be forbidden. I mean, the idea of triggering an event in one place in the world and expecting it to operate in a vacuum is totally untrue. In fact, in China, that recent earthquake, it rung the planet like a bell, triggering smaller quakes thousands of miles away, because those waves of energy as they transit the planet actually act to trigger these other events. Now, when you look at them from sort of from a distance and you monitor energy fields that could trigger these events, then you could draw those clear conclusions. Right now, any of such monitoring would be classified, and I expect that our government and many other governments are doing it. And, when you look at China, China's involved in this research. The former Soviet Union, Russia, is involved in this research. Israel, United States, Great Britain, and others. That they're all smart enough to know you start waging that war even covertly, the other guy's going to know it. And I'm sure there's a lot of saber rattling in this area when these guys get together to talk. But the reality is, it can happen, and this very well could be. It's certainly possible. Well,
it could be a reaction to China's. I read an article the other day where 70,000 producers in China are now demanding payment not in U.S. dollars, but in either gold-backed euros or even Chinese money. This could be a retaliation for that.
Right, and this is, the thing about all of this is we are really, kind of everyone's raising sabers, because you've got a $1.5 and growing $1 trillion cash reserve in China that could be spent and devastate our economy. And on the other hand, you've got, hey, if you do that, we'll do this. And that's the kind of thing that the Cold War's always been based on, and it really hasn't ended. It just shifted a little bit.
Well, Nick, do you know of any independent monitoring organization that is able or willing to go public and protect the public by giving out notices on when this very possible technology is being used?
There's nothing that I'm aware of that's set up for that right now. There's certainly the experts around that could deal with it. I mean, if there's people who have done this work and could participate in such a thing, but we just never seen it happen, and it would be a very expensive, ongoing kind of project. And it really belongs to, I guess there's private groups that could do it, but it seems to me that it needs to be a combination of private organizations that can police not just government, but large corporations that oftentimes are used as the surrogate for government because they're exempt from things like the Freedom of Information Act. So you give projects to contractors, kind of like giving your military to contractors, and then they're not accountable for anything. That's what another big shift in the technology area is that we're very concerned about, because the same thing that's happening in the military in terms of contracting out your services organizations like Blackwater is happening with military technologies, very advanced technologies, so they don't have to be accountable.
Exactly. So what you're saying is because of the cost and the time involved in monitoring such activity, it almost has to go to the public sector, which means government, which means the government, which sees it as weaponry, would probably classify it, would never tell us anyway.
Right. It's a catch-22. And there's just no source of funds for this kind of private enterprise, although it could be done, I mean, this kind of project certainly could be done.
Now, we've been talking about earthquakes, but I'm assuming that this is also possible to use focused electromagnetic energy to perhaps heat up and stir up a tropical storm into hurricane proportions.
This is the other thing that comes up, and it happens in two different ways. One is by the heating of systems like HAARP. You can create a heating effect where you could take a tropical storm, for instance, where you have the cold oceans, or vice versa, the warm oceans and the colder atmospheric temperatures, and you get these kinds of formations. And it's a question of how much heat can you pump into the system. HAARP alone could not do it, but could it capitalize on energy, again, already available? Can it tap energy from the system of the Earth and actually cause it to route in a way that heats up these areas? And the answer to that is probably yes. In a smaller scale, on tornadoes, actual work was done on this, where you could knock out the energy of tornadoes or perhaps increase it using HAARP as a focusing instrument for heat energy, essentially transferring it into the cold fronts where these cold fronts and warm fronts come together and you get that shearing action where the tornado forms. The idea was you could heat up these cold fronts so that the energy differentials were neutralized and tornadoes would not form. The opposite is also true. You could heat up the already existing warm front to get a greater differential of energy and perhaps create even bigger tornadoes. And that was something that was done by Dr. Eastland for the European Space Agency, and also a follow-on research project done for, interestingly enough, FEMA and NASA, where they would utilize not HAARP but space-based lasers to create these kinds of effects, which I thought was kind of interesting.
So what do I understand correctly then that it's pretty dubious that HAARP by itself could actually generate these hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever, but it can augment them, and it can alter them, may even be able to stop them or defuse them, I guess.
Right. Or perhaps add energy to them. And, as these systems get bigger, which they are, I mean, here in Alaska, HAARP is quadrupled in size from when we first started talking about it, and at that size has had barely one season to operate. So, there's a lot more to come, I think, in the area, and it's not just about HAARP. There are many, many systems that produce signals that can be used for weather modification. In fact, there's even commercial companies now that are actually out there advertising and promoting weather modification. The problem, again, is you can't affect one part of this system without it having a downstream and unpredictable effect on the rest of it. Now, applying the principle of the butterfly effect, where the flapping of a butterfly's wings in South America create a storm in Asia, and people laugh, but it's actually a principle that a small amount of energy in just the right way creates a chain reaction that is not so easily modeled. And the same is true with the entire planet. When you're injecting huge changes in regional areas, they have effect on the entire planet.
Well, it's kind of like the old rhyme about for want of a nail, the shoe was lost for want of the shoe, the horse was lost for want of the horse, the general was lost for want of the general, the battle was lost.
There you have it.
Kind of tracks all the way up. Well, tell me if this is it's my understanding, and tell me if this is true, that let's say we have a hurricane, okay, whether it's HAARP generated or whether it's just a natural hurricane, but by using lasers and or electromagnetic energy, you could heat the water to one side or the other of the hurricane and actually steer it on a course that you want to take.
Now that kind of idea is certainly a possibility, and and that's an interesting one because exactly those kinds of scenarios. Again, here you have a natural thing that occurs, and then to be able to move it along, it has the force of a nuclear devastation without the fallout. It's that kind of weapons effect, and this is why it's been pursued. In fact, it was the last Secretary Rumsfeld, when he was expressing an interest in getting rid of the environmental treaties because weather modification had reached a level where we really wanted to do it, not have to cheat on a treaty to do it, although that never has slowed us down too much before.
When have we ever bothered with treaties? Just ask the Native Americans. Okay, we need to take a break right now. We'll be back right after this with Dr. Nick Begich. This is Jim Mars. See you on the other side. Howdy, this is Jim Mars. We're back here on Dreamland. Today we're talking to Dr. Nick Begich. We've been covering some pretty good ground here about weather modification, about the use of the HAARP energy array in Alaska to perhaps produce earthquakes, hurricanes, and then perhaps even guide hurricanes or tornadoes wherever you want to go. It's really a scary thing because what a wonderful weapon from any nation standpoint. You devastate your enemy's country with earthquake or hurricanes or a tidal wave, and gee, it's not us. It's just an act of God. But Nick, what's even more scary, and this is you've gotten into this at some depth, is mind control. In fact, in your Earth Rising series, I think the number one DVD is Mind Control, and then followed by Technologies in the 21st Century, and then HAARP, the update, and finally you get into the Earth Changes. But Let's go to Mind Control, because that's pretty spooky. Most Americans are all upset about too much surveillance, the fact that privacy is dwindling, if not non-existent, and yet what's even scarier to me is the idea that they can somehow impact upon our thinking processes. Run us through just some of the basics of this.
Sure. This is the most controversial area of our work, and the DVD on the subject and the book on the subject both really cover it in depth. 250 sources were used, going back to the very early days of where hypnotherapy at Harvard in the 20s was being looked at. And that's kind of where it started. The real excitement, though, began right after the Korean War, when we had all these returning veterans that had been prisoners of war acting out in the most bizarre ways, handing out communist leaflets on street corners, And the phrase brainwashing was coined in the early 50s as a result of that. And then our CIA, Central Intelligence Organizations, began to look at this and actually get involved in the research. And there's, of course, everyone now that follows these issues is aware of the MK Ultra programs and 140-plus sub-projects under MK Ultra, which was a mind control program of the Central Intelligence Agency. It was later revealed in a presidential report done in 1976, June of 76, that actually laid open this whole program of the CIA and the FBI's involvement in using unwitting Americans in experiments to see what they could do to manipulate their brain activity. And a lot of it was using chemicals. I mean, they had 8,000 servicemen and women that were given LSD and other hallucinogenics to see what would happen there. Telepathine, ketamine, various drugs were used. And then also interestingly enough. Electromagnetic field manipulation, first flashing light and electromagnetic fields, and then more sophisticated systems as time went on. This became, in the early 70s, a subject of congressional inquiry through the church committees, but did not end there. In fact, the most recent, I've got an RFP, a request for proposal, in my hands from the Electromagnetic Directorate of the Air Force that actually is open until 2009, a year from now, for proposals for more advanced systems for manipulating human behavior. And of course, then there's the new rules for human experiments. A lot of things have happened in the area and continue to happen at an increasing pace in this area today.
Well, Nick, before we get further on, I've got a doozy for you. But first, tell us where you can get your DVDs and your books.
Sure. The books and DVDs are available at EarthPulse, EARTHPULSE, earthpulse.com. And you can also get them toll-free at 888-690-1277, 888-690-1277, and get a catalog, and we'll send it out to you.
Do I assume that you can ask your local bookstore to order them?
Absolutely. A lot of the bookstores carry them. We've done so much in this area, and probably when you look at the whole of it, a lot of good material. There's also about 6 or 8 hours on this subject of mind control, free video available at our website at earthpulse.com and our research site at layinstitute.org.
Was Angels Don't Play This HAARP, was that your first book?
Yeah, it was, and that we wrote it back in fact, it was interesting. The same month it came out, in September 94, that same month, an article came out in Popular Science, which, interestingly enough, in the July issue that's due on the newsstands about mid-month in June of this year, 2008, they're doing an update. Popular Science is doing another story on HAARP, so people should watch for that as well.
Great. Well, now, back to mind control. Are you concerned, as I am, about the possibility that the Republican designated nominee, John McCain, in his book, openly admits that for 5.5 years he was in the hands of Soviet mind control experts?
That would concern me because of the work that has been done in this area in the U.S. In fact, there is a lot of papers by a guy named Estabrooks who worked at Harvard University back in the 20s, and up and through the 1960s he was doing work in this field. And what he had developed is a method where 20% of the population he could take into a deep enough hypnotic state that in 10 months he could split a personality into 2 unique characters, one that would have full knowledge of the other and the other that would have no knowledge of the other. So you could create what he considered to be the super spy. Now, this started in the 20s. His work was classified in the mid-30s. Today, we would call that person a Manchurian candidate. 5.5 years is about 8 times as much time as you need to condition a person for that kind of sleeper sort of activity. Now, whether John McCain was subjected to that kind of work or not, I have no clue. But it is certainly possible based on the work of Estabrooks, and people can look him up at the Library of Congress and get a sense of who he is. His bio is well publicized. He did a lot of work for government that parallels much of what came out later in terms of exposure of CIA programs in the mind control area specifically. So it is possible to create these kind of sleeper Manchurian candidates. In fact, one of the only identified victims of the MK-Ultra experiments was a guy who went to college over at Harvard University and later became famous in a New York Times article that revealed he was an MK-Ultra victim, and it was the Unabomber. Now, was he a sleeper, or was that the effect of, remember, he was reacting against technology and people that promoted it.
Yeah.
What was that, really? And no one may ever really know the truth.
We may not know. He may have been reacting to his own programming, or he may have been acting on his own programming.
Right. And so who knows?
And I'm with you on John McCain in that we don't really know if he was susceptible to this Manchurian candidate type mind control, or whether he was able to overcome it or withstand it. But I would point out that if you look at John McCain's record, you find out that he has voted for every aid package to Vietnam, and yet he has blocked and dragged his feet and become an obstacle to any of the investigations looking into our missing POWs and MIAs. And then there's the curious fact that in Hanoi today, the one monument they have to U.S. prisoners that were held there is to John McCain.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's all interesting. You know, and a lot of this, you know, the thing about the technologies, the fact that people are finally looking at some of this, you know, we've been covering it for many, many years, and in a way that has become, you know, pretty considered pretty critical in the debate, because we have put together the source documents. So it's not just our words, it's not speculation. This is what the science shows, and we put it in one place so people can understand it. And this is a very important trend. This generation, our generation, will determine whether, in fact, we are open to our potentials as human beings because of what is possible with the human mind, or whether we will become the ultimate in a slave-driven population, because controlling the mind ultimately controls the outcomes politically, economically, in virtually every way that human beings interact.
Absolutely amazing. Well, that, of course, leads me to the question of, is there anything we can do about this as individuals to protect ourselves from outside mental influence?
Well, this comes up quite a bit. In fact, we did a segment for public television in Canada a while back, and one of the folks that was interviewed were the Morrises, a couple that had been involved in a lot of the early Reagan Star Wars advances and some of this psychotronic weapons considerations. And what they said, and I agree, is you could easily screen out on incoming signals like from TV, radio, networks, and so on, these that are biologically active. But for an individual to come up with a solution, no, there's probably not an immediate solution in terms of technological. It's going to ultimately be, I believe, a political solution augmented by technologies that safeguard populations.
In other words, wearing your aluminum foil hat won't necessarily cut it.
That isn't going to do it. You know, the thing about it all is there was a great article called "The Mind Has No Firewalls," published back in '98 in the U.S. Army Quarterly called Perimeters. And what they said, and I think it's revealing, that many things can be used, whether it be telephone lines, TV, radio networks, supply pipes. Any of these things can carry a signal that will manipulate the behavior of those in close contact with such a signal. In fact, even the airwaves literally can carry a signal. There was a guy named Persinger at Laurentian University that did some work in this area for the Central Intelligence Agency, and you could create emotional changes in huge segments of the population by just knowing enough about what kind of signal to broadcast. And it's almost like, by analogy, dialing through the radio stations. When you get resonance or harmony between the transmitter and receiver, everybody gets to hear our voices. But otherwise, it's static between the signals. And the same is true when it comes to manipulating the mind or the body of human beings. It's just an understanding of the signal.
Yes, I know many years ago, someone demonstrated on me what they call the neurophone,
right,
where they placed this thing just on the skin, on my back, and I could actually hear radio signals. I could hear music and people talking and everything else. So when you have people like Timothy McVeigh, who claimed that they had implanted him with a chip in his butt and that they were giving him audible orders, everybody rolled their eyes and said, well, this guy's really a nutcase. But I know from personal experience that that's possible.
Yeah, and this science has even been developed to the point where you need no physical contact at all. In fact, Woody Norris has a company on the exchange. It's ATCO, but it developed acoustic heterodyning, where you could point an instrument at an individual and they would hear a voice as clear as people are hearing our voices today. In fact, he won the MIT Lemelson Prize, $500,000, I think it was in 06 or 05 from MIT, for actually creating that technology. And we've been talking about it now for over 10 years. There's advanced technologies in this area as well, and we get into a little bit of that on those DVDs.
Well, if they can beam a signal at you from afar,
Right.
can that actually alter your thinking and alter your emotions?
Actually, yes. In fact, we point out one particular patent where sound is below the level of audible hearing. In other words, you could create that kind of a signal, drop it down below the level where you even perceived the language. And what they use this for in Japan is in the department stores where they have the elevator music playing. In the background where you don't hear it consciously in 7 languages, they have messages to dissuade and discourage shoplifters, and it has a 40% effect at reducing shoplifting.
Wow.
Now, the reason it's 40% is that's probably the non-professional shoplifter, the people that still have a conscience working sort of in their favor, and they haven't suspended it. But the point is, it really works. It's a powerful, powerful technology, and depending on how you apply it, you can have tremendous effects. Even in the media, when you think about just standard advertising media, subliminals, certain types of subliminals are regulated, but these new technologies are not regulated at all. And that's something that needs serious consideration. I mean, the Internet is barely getting regulated. These technologies have virtually no regulation whatsoever.
Amazing. And I guess if they can impact 40% of the shoppers not to shoplift, they could also impact maybe even more with a message, buy socks, or some kind of
or vote for Joe Smith.
Yeah.
I mean, these are important issues in the 21st century.
Let's return to this. We're going to have to take a break right now, and we'll come right back with Dr. Nick Begich. This is Jim Mars, and we'll be back right after this. Howdy, this is your host today, Jim Mars. We're talking to Dr. Nick Begich, and we're covering a wide spectrum of RF frequency being used to generate earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and now we're talking about being able to alter emotions and even the thinking in the human mind. And Nick was telling us that in Japan they've had a 40% reduction in shoplifting because they put subliminal messages out over the speakers along with the elevator music that says don't shoplift. And Nick, of course, I can recall Vance Packard's book back in the 50s, The Hidden Persuaders, where on television they would flash messages up, and in movies that the human eye picked up, the brain accepted, but consciously you didn't perceive it. And that was just with visual images. What you're talking about are subliminal audio messages. Is that correct?
That's right. And in fact, any of the senses can be overridden. There's an article, and it's in Technology Horizons by the Research Air Force Lab, June 2004, and the cover story is on controlled effects, which deal with all of this idea of creating any of the 5 senses artificially to the point where you couldn't distinguish an artificial experience from the real one. That's where the science is headed. The audible transfers go back even to the 1960s when Fry first demonstrated the transfer of audible material through microwave, in other words, at a distance. The neurophonic technology, which has evolved into other technologies, started in the late 1950s. So, we're talking about transfers in science that goes back now like 50 years, and yet very few people know much about it. In the book Controlling the Human Mind, we had over 250 sources, including dozens of U.S. patents, that sort of lay the foundation, first talking about the biological mechanisms by which these things actually operate, and then sort of tracing the history through, unfortunately, primarily the military that has got the budgets and has developed most of the science in the area.
Right. Well, this is really spooky stuff because it reminds me of that movie trilogy about the Matrix, where people thought they were living a normal, happy, conventional life, and in reality that was a virtual reality being piped into them because they were actually emaciated husk hooked into a machine. Of course, that's
right.
Futuristic.
Right. In the science of the mind, the neurological sciences, it is the great frontier in terms of human beings, and the mind is the link between what is physical and how we perceive, through these senses, this world, and that which is not. Now, and it sounds esoteric, but think about it in just simple terms, like a marine mammal, a dolphin, can hear frequencies up to 250,000 hertz. Human beings can hear, if they're lucky, up to 24,000 hertz. In other words, a dolphin hears 10 times the range of sound that we do, and yet because we don't hear the sound, we don't perceive the sound through the medium of our senses and the interpretation of that by the mind. Does the sound not exist? Of course the sound exists. We just don't perceive it through our sensors that we recognize. And yet, that's the area where consciousness and mind sort of mix, because as we learn more about the neurology of the mind, perhaps we discover more about those things that connect us to the rest of this creation on a level that is not physical. I mean, think about radio waves and think about television and think about how the mind might actually function, and you get a much different perception of what our reality might consist of.
Well, of course, when you go in that direction, you could almost argue that our whole perceived reality is nothing more than one frequency wavelength that we're all on. That's just one dimension of, perhaps thousands or millions.
And that's not so far fetched in the science, and perhaps even there's the work of Tiller, which is pretty interesting stuff. As a physicist, he looks at sort of our reality creation, and in physics, most people are aware that you can observe something, and then because you're observing it, in your interaction as the observer, it changes it from a particle to a wave, from a physical thing to an energy thing. Now,
right.
If we drive that on that fundamental level, perhaps we drive that on the entire creation, sort of in this big orchestrated concert of human consciousness.
Well, I recall one of the military remote viewers that was in the Army's program once told me that we're living on the equivalent of one page of a universal Bible.
There you go. And that's probably a good way to look at just in terms of how we perceive the reality around us. And when you talk about the mechanism, which is the mind, controlling it. Now, what did these guys really find? We always hear about the sinister side, and we've talked about it a lot over the years, and yet there's a more important dimension to this than just controlling people. It's what they discovered about human potential, our latent potentials, which go well beyond what we think our capabilities are. And I believe this is what the root of mind control is really about. It's about denying you and I our birthright as created human beings with tremendous creative potential that is kept in check. And one of the easiest ways to keep that in check is in an environment of fear, worry, and paranoia, because in those environments, the brain, if you were to monitor it, you get incoherent brain patterns, usually in the beta ranges, that don't lend themselves to these higher states of human consciousness. For those states, whether it's the alpha range, which is approximately 7 to 12 hertz, or the theta ranges, which are associated with hypnosis and some of the altered states of consciousness, or the deep delta states associated with the deepest states of sleep, and perhaps some of the more esoteric things people experience. But each of these states, these slower paced brain waves, require a different kind of environment. When you create an environment of fear, you immediately eliminate the human being from being able to reach their higher states of consciousness. Once we know this, we can start to guard against it so that we do head in the opposite direction, one where we're fully empowered as human beings to do those things that we were created to do. This is the big travesty of mind control technologies, is they deny us access to the science that could help us reach these higher states.
Absolutely, and I think, of course, that's the purpose by the people who are in control of these technologies, because they want to stay in control of it. They are after power, they're after wealth, and they don't want the average human to realize his or her full potential.
But that's exactly it. And you look at the fascination of military and extrasensory perception over the years. We posted hundreds and hundreds of pages of declassified defense intelligence data on what we used to call extrasensory perception, or what the military called in those days paraphysics. And yet, this is not old science. This is old science that continues to be created on a more sophisticated level as our technologies advance.
That's correct. Now, that leads to the big question that's parallel to the question we had some years ago about, can they tap your telephone? Well, yes, of course they can. Can they control your mind? Apparently so. The real question is, are they? And, Nick, I have to say that it seems to me that it would take a mammoth amount of funds and a huge number of people to try to work on all the rest of the population. Do you think that they can target whole sections of the population, or are they limited to just trying to work on a few individuals?
No. You can. The delivery systems are varied and huge. Any electromagnetic carrier, as I said, can be utilized to carry a signal to affect large segments of the population, and this has been used in military events. Project Solo is applied not just for propaganda, but for exactly this. In fact, Scottish media reported during the first Gulf War, before we went in, on the radio broadcast of the Muslim music and prayers, we embedded signals that created an environment of fear and anxiety, and we watched the fourth largest army in the world give up like kids on their first fire drill in an elementary school. And that type of technology, and for emotional effect, you can do lots of different things to create that. For specific words, frames of ideas, there are things that you can do that can utilize the existing TV, radio networks, internet, etc., to create those kinds of effects, particularly the internet. And in fact, there was a guy named Smirnov who appeared in a special with me on the very subject of mind control. He works in the former Soviet Union, and this whole issue is one that everyone has taken serious for a very long time. My last conversations with Dr. Eastland before he passed away dealt with his interactions with DARPA and the interest at the very top of DARPA in these sciences today. And we put together through the Lay Institute last year a conference on mind effects where this whole topic was massaged by some of the best minds outside of government. So, when you start to look at as the thing evolves, our hope is that the real action is people become aware enough, begin to ask the tough questions, and eventually we see the kinds of congressional inquiries that lead to a much, much different approach in this area of science.
Right. Well, it's an awful scary thing, but I just have to say that I don't think they can control my thinking any way, shape, or form because, I have to go watch American Idol. Oops. Wait a minute. I'm back. Maybe they can control your thinking.
Well, these are the simple things. Just creating fear in a population is such an easy thing.
Yeah. So maybe it's time that we start taking control of our own thoughts.
Well, and that's we can do this. The fact is, as we become aware of the things that can afflict us, then we at least are empowered enough to start acting on the knowledge. And what I said in these areas is, don't be fearful. Recognize that these things exist, but they too can be regulated in ways as simple as the drinking water that we drink or the sewage that we dispel. We can regulate this as well, and the science is certainly there to support it. It's just going to take a different kind of view of populations, maybe going back to that original view that individuals do matter, and what we have to say does count, and it's not some big group think, but this country and many countries around the world were founded on the idea that all people are created equal. And what I have a message for everyone is, not only are we created equal, we have more potential latent in every one of us than we've ever seen in the best creative minds on the planet. Once we recognize and begin to act that way, things will change.
That's absolutely correct, and just the sheer knowingness of it will make for changes. Now, I would say the first step for everyone listening to this program, first step is to educate yourself, become aware of these issues. Like the Alcoholics Anonymous says, the first step is to recognize that we have a problem. And I would think of no better place to start than with Dr. Nick Begich and his book, Controlling the Human Mind, his DVDs on mind control, HAARP, Earth Changes. And Nick, it's just been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. And I thank you so much for coming on. And any last words?
I just appreciate it, and I just look forward to this next year. Lot is coming, and let's not give up. A lot of changes in the air.
You're absolutely right, both good and bad. So let's all work for the good. Thank you, Dr. Nick Begich. This is Jim Mars, your host today on Dreamland, saying adios.
Linda Moulton Howe will return next week.
Years later, but on the backdrop of very, very new technology.
Exactly. And that leads me to my first question, which I can't wait to hear your response, is that on the Internet now there is a lot of chatter going on about the possibility that the recent devastating earthquake in China may have been actually man-made, may have been generated, and some people are even pointing the finger at the HAARP array. With your background on HAARP, number one, is it possible to use that technology to generate earthquakes? Number two, do you feel like that this recent earthquake may indeed be a result of that technology?
Well, it certainly could be used in that way. We talked about it in our very first book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, years ago. And there's also a more recent quote dealing with electromagnetic waves affecting these things. And this is from Secretary of Defense William Cohen, and we quoted it in Earth Rising, the Revolution. And it says, others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves, unquote. Now, that was strong feelings about that, as well as strong feelings about the FBI in terms of what they were doing at the time. They were responsible for tapping congressional phone lines, for intercepting mail, a lot of things that he found objectionable. He really disliked J. Edgar Hoover, who by that time was gone, but primarily because he was essentially blackmailing the Congress. The FBI was essentially a rogue institution, and again, just before Watergate, where a lot of things changed at the federal level by virtue of the fact that people lost confidence.
Right, starting with Nixon, and then particularly through the Reagan years, and now we see the culmination of this today. And but that may be a whole different discussion.
Well, it is related, Jim, because, back in those days, that was when the church committee hearings began shortly thereafter,
right.
A lot of investigation into abuses of government, which, of course, Richard Nixon was famous for. And we're kind of going through that again. The privacy issues are back on the plate. People are concerned. I mean, the issue we're talking about today, mind control, the ultimate issue of personal privacy, all these years.
Howdy, this is your host today, Jim Mars, here on Dreamland. And today we're going to be talking with Dr. Nick Begich, probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about the HAARP array in Alaska, of which we've heard so much, and about its uses for weather control and maybe even more sinisterly, mind control. Nick, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Can you briefly, I know it could probably stretch on, but briefly give us a little bit of your background, your education, and what qualifies you to know so much about electromagnetic energy and its uses?
Well, this particular area we've followed for the last 15 years. I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines with an interest in electrophysiology, the effects of electromagnetic fields on the human body. My other background is political. I come from a highly political family here in Alaska. In fact, my brother Mark is running for the U.S. Senate this year. My dad was in the United States Congress, was in the state Senate for a number of years. I've been active in the Alaska Federation of Teachers, the Anchorage Council of Education, twice being elected president of both organizations, and I've written 5 books in 7 languages, primarily on technology and science. I also serve as the executive director of the Lay Institute on Technologies, which is a Texas-based nonprofit organized around educating the public on the effects of technologies.
Right. And isn't it true that your dad was lost on the same plane flight as Senator Hale Boggs?
Right. It was Congressman Boggs was the majority leader in the U.S. House at the time. This is back in the early 1970s, just before the Watergate hearings. The plane disappeared, was never recovered, no wreckage found, nothing all these years.
Right, and just as a side note there, Representative Boggs from Louisiana was one of the first of the Warren Commission members to publicly question their findings about a lone assassin.
Right, that's correct. In fact, he had, back in April of 1997, when Secretary William Cohen was Secretary of Defense, and he made that comment. Now, with HAARP, you can actually manipulate gravity waves, and as a consequence, there's a lot of concern that this could be used for exactly that, for geophysical manipulation, and HAARP has the ability of being the signal being manipulated in such ways as to couple with these natural systems of the Earth affecting things like climate, things like earthquakes, based on the research we've done, and hundreds of footnoted sources, as well as discussions with the inventor, Dr. Bernard Eastland, right up until his death in December of last year. We had an open dialogue with Dr. Eastland regarding these kinds of effects.
Well, you know, it actually even goes back to Lyndon Johnson, who once talked about the control of weather and using it as a weapon. In fact, Nick, I recall in the 70s, as a reporter for the Metropolitan newspaper, I wrote a big research article